Welcome to another episode of Discovering the Jewish Roots. I'm Dr. Rick Wadge. We are working through the Gospel of Matthew. We're focusing upon the Semitic character of the letter itself and the teachings of Yeshua, Jesus. And we are in chapter 5, which is historically called the Sermon on the Mount. Now, if you recall from last week's session, we were looking at the usage of God's name being spoken by the common person, and we found that it was only used once a year. So I want to pick up where we left off last time, and I want to talk about this complex system that really had developed during the first century period of being able to swear an oath, but not take God's name in vain. And if you recall, it was by using the name of somebody with authority, especially a deity, that the person would say, you can count on what I'm saying, you can take it to the bank because I'm swearing by my God. And of course, in the scriptures, we're told not to do this. And specifically, we're looking at Yeshua's words on this as well. So this complex system had developed in the first century where they could avoid using the name of God, but still in an inadvertent way, point to God as being the source behind them keeping their promise. Now, I want to give you a direct quote that comes to us from the Babylonian Talmud as quoted by Dr. Lightfoot, and it says this: "If any swear by heaven, by earth, by the sun, etc., although the mind of the swearer be under these words to swear by him who created them, yet this is not an oath. Of if any swear by some of the prophets or by some of the books of the scriptures, although the sense of the swearer be to swear by him that sent that prophet or that gave that book, nevertheless, this is not an oath." And this is exactly what we've been talking about. And that is a way of getting around directly using the name of God, but still pointing to God as being the source who will stand behind the person's words, the person's promise, the person's oath. So it was kind of an indirect communication way of getting around that, but still being able to break the oath because you didn't use the name of God. Now, Yeshua, Jesus, insists, and he says this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, he says, "Let your word be yes as yes, and your no as no. Whatever is more than these comes from the evil one." Matthew 5:37. Now, what I want you to pick up in this little text here is that the usage of double words, yes, yes, no, no, is what's called emphatic construction. It's the intensive, repetitive use of an affirmative particle, yes, yes, a negative particle, no, no. And it means that when we say yes to something, it should absolutely be yes. And when we say no to something, it should absolutely, unequivocally be no. No double meaning, no deception, no games. People need to be able to count on what we're saying, what we're promising, period. Now, my disciples is what Jesus is saying. He's saying that his disciples should be of such a moral character that when the disciple gives his word or an oath on something given in the name of anyone is completely unnecessary, because you can count on the disciple, because you can count on his rabbi who trained the disciple. Friends, this is so important. in the 21st century, we live among people who just throw promises out but don't stand behind them. And by the way, Yeshua, Jesus's half-brother Yaakov, we call him James, said the very same thing. Look at what he says in James chapter 5, verse 12. He says, "But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your," here it is, the words of Yeshua, his half-brother, "but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation." Now, the Babylonian Talmud said the exact same thing, and it says this in Bava Batra 49b, that's the back side of the page. It says, "A righteous yes is a yes, and a righteous no is a no." Now, friends, the question I have for you is, do you have this characteristic in your life? Can people count on your yes being yes and your no being no? Do you follow through with what you say you're going to do? It is so important, because I can't tell you how many believers I've run into throughout my life that have said one thing and then never followed through, and it is a bad depiction upon their God. You begin to wonder, well, what did they actually learn from the words in the Bible? Well, by the way, just so we kind of finish off an overview of those groups that taught the very same thing, the Dead Sea Scroll community, the Qumran community, the Essenes, also made the point of not taking any oaths except when someone was entering into the brotherhood of the followers at the Qumran community. And this is a topic as well with the Pharisees, with the Essenes, with Yeshua, of course. They were all in agreement with one another. Don't allow your inconsistencies to make God look bad. Let your own character be the reason that people can trust you, because they know who you've been taught by, they know who you follow, and you're a person of your word. Well, let's continue now in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, starting at verse 38. And it says this, "And you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not retaliate against the wicked person. To the one who strikes you upon the right cheek, turn the other as well. And if someone wants to quarrel with you and take your tunic, give him your cloak as well. If someone forces you to walk a mile with him on the road, go with him too. And if one asks of you, give it to him. And if one comes to borrow from you, do not turn his face away from you." Now, it's hard to explain this passage really without making reference to what the Jewish community was forced to deal with during that time period in the Second Temple period. You see, if you lived in Israel during the time of Yeshua, Jesus, you were faced with Jewish men being constantly killed by the Romans. For this or for that, it didn't really take a whole lot. And the Romans, by the way, were constantly raping the Jewish women of the villages. So in response to this, the Jewish zealots felt it was their God-given responsibility to take vengeance on those Romans. And the Encyclopedia Judaica actually records that in the Talmud, there is a report from Alexandria, Egypt, which had, by the way, a very large Jewish community at that time, that brides were abducted from under the very wedding canopy. Wow, that is just incredible when you think about that. But that's what was going on. That's what the Jews were facing every single day during the Roman occupation. Now, the community at the Dead Sea, the Essenes, wanted a holy war with the Romans, and you can understand rightfully so why they would. They were tired of the injustice, they were tired of the persecution, and this is what they called then the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. Of course, the Jewish followers were the sons of light, and of course the Romans then were the dogs, and they were the sons of darkness. Now, they wrote about how God's angels would join them in their fight against the Romans and that they would succeed in winning the battle. Now, friends, pause just for a moment, because even though they had it in their minds that God would fight for them and win the battle with the Romans in the first century using angelic warfare, it didn't happen, did it? In 70 AD, even the temple itself was destroyed. And of course, Qumran was leveled, and almost every part of the Jewish culture was leveled. And the Jews were faced to either go into complete bondage or be exiled to go somewhere else to try to live. This seems to be the context then for this section in Matityahu Levi in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus Yeshua is answering the question of what to do regarding the brutal nature of these Romans. What do we do? What do we do? And of course, the rabbi steps up and he says, this is how you handle things. So friends, here's the question I have for you. How do you imitate your rabbi? How do you imitate your rabbi who is God's Messiah when you're faced with complete injustice? And in this world, we have injustice. It's taking place all around us, in the political realm, in the battlefields around the world, in the poverty that's taking place among the peoples. We are seeing complete injustice, but does that mean that God has abandoned us? No. Does it mean that the angels aren't still fighting for us? Of course they are. And the Word of God promises that every single person who is following after God, certainly those have a warring angel. They have a guardian angel who is with him. Look at the scriptures. I mean, it's very clear on this. Without becoming wacky about the subject and taking it too far, just know that God is for you. He is not against you. He is fighting for you every day. His Spirit is with you. He's leading you into truth. But does that mean that injustice is vanquished? Absolutely not. We fight against spiritual powers every day, even if we don't see it. And sadly, we also fight against the physical powers of darkness that are being influenced around the world to fight against the sons of light, which, by the way, if you're a follower of God, if you're a follower of the Messiah, you are a son or daughter of light. So how do you imitate your rabbi? Well, the Torah says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but it doesn't teach us to exact vengeance upon those who brutalize us. And that is a misconception that we think it does. The Torah stands for equality, and the Torah stands, God's instruction stands for justice. So realize throughout this sermon that Yeshua is giving that Rabbi Yeshua has been constantly instructing his followers to practice justice and equity and righteousness when we deal with others. So to now bring in the theme of the Romans, given what we know about them and what they were doing, and we're trying to follow after this Messiah who's talking about peace and turning the other cheek and going the extra mile, he's being very practical with how they need to imitate him. Now, could they imitate their rabbi? That's the question. Did they imitate their rabbi? Because in a very short time, their rabbi was going to live out this message that he had just given in how to live with Romans, how to deal with darkness, how to live with injustice, how to deal with the brutal nature of evil while remaining silent, while being scourged, and then while dying on the cross. So more than us just thinking that Jesus, Yeshua, was teaching you're better than living by an eye for an eye, does the Torah actually teach personal revenge? And I'm going to tell you, and it is going to tell you, absolutely no.
Did you know that the book of Matthew was originally written in Aramaic, the language of Jesus? You know, there comes a time in a person's life when you want to know what you believe and why you believe it. when you have to stop the madness of the modern world and go back to where you first believed. You can do that with Israel TV Network. For the first time in over 2,000 years, a line-by-line commentary on the Aramaic original book of Matthew has been created by Dr. Rick Wadge. You can learn along by watching Israel TV Network, Discovering the Jewish Roots. You can own this piece of history by going to Amazon.com and ordering Discovering the Jewish Roots of the Book of Matthew. Stop the world, enhance your mind with the unchanging Word of God today.
It does not teach personal revenge. Now, the term an eye for an eye was a common expression in the ancient Near East for the practice of fair and equitable punishment. The Torah, God's instruction manual, and the Torah courts of law never actually poked out anyone's eyes or knocked out anyone's teeth, even though David talks about wanting to do it. It was an expression which indicated if something happens to you, we're to make sure that it's justly dealt with. It was the same as saying, let the punishment fit the crime. Now, something that we've lost in the American system of justice is allowing the crime to fit the punishment. We have a big problem with that, don't we? Because we let people go all the time that have committed atrocious crimes against their fellow man, against society. Well, in this day, in this time, when they were following after the Torah, it was the law of equal weight and value. It's the minimum amount that's required for legal compensation, this eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. And by the way, it was almost always a monetary compensation that was being sought after. The Talmud explains it like this. It says this. It says, an eye for an eye, well, that means a payment of money. You say that it means payment of money, but perhaps the intention is that the actual eye must be forfeited. Supposing, however, the rabbis are arguing, supposing, however, that the eye of the one was large and of the other small, how can I, in that case, apply the scriptural dictum, an eye for an eye? Or supposing that a blind man had knocked out the eye of another, or a man with an amputated arm had cut off the arm of another, or a lame man had made another lame. How can I fulfill, in this case, an eye for an eye, the question is? And then the rabbis continue with their discussion, and they say, the Torah declared, you shall have one manner of law. Leviticus 24:22. That means a law which shall be the same for all of you. You see, what the rabbi is explaining here in the Babylonian Talmud is that an eye for an eye clearly means a compensation of money, not a compensation of flesh and blood. So, Yeshua urges his disciples to be of a very different breed of people. His message to them is, don't press charges, don't litigate, don't demand your rights, don't demand your equal measure. He says God is going to deal with this stuff. He agreed with the teachings of God's instruction manual, which says in Leviticus 19:18, it says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Does that sound familiar? And then it goes on to say, I am the Lord. In other words, that's the authority behind this command. Look, love your neighbor as yourself. God is telling you this is what you must do. How about the words of Solomon? Shlomo, he was considered to be the wisest man at that time period. Proverbs 24:29. Do not say, I will do to him as he has done to me. I will pay him back for what he has done. Proverbs 20:22 says, do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will help you. Okay, Matthew chapter 5, verse 40. If someone wants to quarrel, Yeshua is speaking, if someone wants to quarrel with you and take your tunic, give him your cloak as well. Now, in the classic book, The Lost Message of Jesus, Steve Kalk points this out, and he says, and I love this quote, he says, the poor had only two garments, an outer and an inner one. In other words, their underwear. According to Deuteronomy 24:10 through 13, if someone owed a great debt and was unable to pay, a creditor was allowed to take the outer garment of the debtor as collateral, but he had to return it each evening so that the poor man could sleep in it. See, we're talking about justice, equality. And it was this very same scenario that's played out in Jesus' instruction concerning the soldier who forces a Jew to carry his pack in Matthew chapter 5, verse 41. Check it out. If someone forces you to walk a mile with him on the road, go with him too. You see, under Roman law, the soldier could only require him to carry it for a mile. But Jesus says this. He says, carry it 2 miles. See what he does. I'm paraphrasing. Carry it 2 miles. Watch the baffled look on his face. Carry it 2 miles, and maybe he'll ask about your God. Carry it 2 miles and see how it changes his disposition of the Jewish people. And then Rabbi Yeshua deals once again with the thrust and the proof of righteousness, the evidence of how he treats the poor in Matthew chapter 5, verse 42. If one asks if you give it to him, and if one comes to borrow from you, do not turn his face away from you. The writings that Yeshua lived by can be found in, for example, that would influence him on this, in Leviticus 19:10. What does it say? It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field to its very border, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Wow, God looks out for those that are less fortunate, doesn't he? Deuteronomy chapter 15, starting in verse 7. These are the words that Jesus, Yeshua, lived by. It says this, if there be among you a poor man, one of your brethren, in any of your towns within your land, which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for this need, whatever it may be. Take heed lest there be a base thought in your heart, and you say, the 7th year, the year of release is near, and your eye be hostile to your poor brother, and you give him nothing. And he cried to the Lord against you, and it be sin in you. It goes on. It says, you shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him. Because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all of your work and in all that you undertake. For the poor will never cease out of the land. Therefore, I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and to the poor in the land. You know, friends, in fact, the entire sacrificial system was interpreted by the rabbis of Yeshua, Jesus' day, in terms of charity to the poor. Look at what it says. God says to Israel, my sons, whenever you give sustenance to the poor, I impute it as though you gave sustenance to me. For it says, my bread. Does then God eat and drink? No. But whenever you give food to the poor, God accounts it to you as if you gave food to him. How about this in Bava Batra 9b? He who gives alms in secret is greater than Moshe, than Moses. Giving to the needs of the poor weighs as much as all the other commandments. Here's the sayings of the fathers, Pirkei Avot 1:5. It says, let your house be wide open and let the poor be members of your household. Ecclesiastes 4:5. Do not avert your eye from the needy or give a man accusation to curse you. How about this? Ecclesiastes 29:1. He that shows mercy will lend to his neighbor, and he that strengthens him with his hand keeps the commandments. By the way, tzedakah, or righteousness, the thing that Yeshua has been discussing over and over and over again throughout this chapter in Matthew chapter 5, is defined by the rabbis as, check it out, drum roll, Tzedakah is charity for the poor, period. Simple. Isn't that easy? Charity for the poor, that's righteousness. And then we finish this chapter with a discussion on Yeshua's words found in verses 43 through 48 of Matthew chapter 5. It says this: "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your fellow and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who hurt you and pursue you, so that you will be sons of your Father who is in heaven, who makes his sun shine for the evil and for the good, and sends rains on the Zedekim as well as upon the wicked. For if you love those who love you, what is your reward? Do not even the tax collectors do that? And if you ask of the shalom of only your brothers, what's your praise? Do not even the tax collectors do that? Therefore, be peaceable and just as your Father who is in heaven is peaceable." Here, Yeshua, Jesus, is quoting from Leviticus 19, where it says, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason with your brother, lest you bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear any grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." See, loving your neighbor but hating your enemy doesn't originate in the Torah. People think that it does because Yeshua, Jesus, is saying, "You have heard it said." Actually, Yeshua is contrasting the commands of the Torah to the interpretation of the Essenes, the Jewish sect at the Dead Sea at that time. In scroll 1QS, otherwise known as the Community Scroll, we read this, and it says, "The Master shall teach the saints to live according to the book of the community rule, that they may seek God with a whole heart and soul and do what is good and right before him, as he commanded by the hand of Moses and all his servants the prophets, that they may love all that he has chosen," and here it is, "and hate all that he has rejected, that they may abstain from all evil and hold fast to all good." But the Master once again brings in a correct interpretation of what was being taught by that community at that time. And he says this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44. He says, but I say to you, he says, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who hurt you and pursue you." Really, Master? Really, Rabbi? Really? Even to the Romans? Even to the dogs? Even to those who are evil? Even to those who seek to take our lives, rape the women, kill the men, destroy our very religion? Really, Rabbi? Really? We should pray for them? And the answer is very simple. Yes. You see, God has called us to be radically different from the world. He's called us to live in the upside down world, where we do just the opposite of what the ungodly world would do. And by doing so, we teach them that there's another kingdom, and that kingdom is on its way. And I and you, we are citizens of that kingdom under that king. As the rabbi teaches us once again how to be different and how to be godly. Well, we'll pick it up where we left off next week. Until then, shalom, shalom.